Hello, this is a modern retelling of the Nativity for Great Britain in 2024. Written by me, I hope you enjoy. Let me tell you a story, a magical story. Mary and Joseph were visited by an angel called Gabriel, who told them that Mary was to give birth to the Son of God. Mary was worried about this. She only earned minimum wage, and her and Joseph had already seen their mortgage increase by £600 a month under Liz Truss. Times were going to be very difficult for these normal, working people. Still, putting a brave face on, they headed out of town to give birth, rather than stay and do it in Nazareth, where they'd heard there weren't enough midwives. As they arrived in Bethlehem, they struggled to find somewhere to park. None of the machines took coins, and they couldn't download the Ringo app without creating a Google Play account. Joseph was a carpenter, a tool maker, and technology had never been his thing. Fortunately, they later discovered that for £64 an hour they could park in the car park itself and tap out on their way off. As they entered the hospital, they were barked at by a sour-faced cow on reception who was incredulous that they weren't wearing masks, despite the fact that the plague finished a couple of years ago. Ironically enough, all of the signs extolling the virtues of hand washing meant nothing, as the hand sanitizer stations were all empty. In fact, the whole place looked a bleeding dump. A tired-looking woman with matted hair and a stained tabard pushed a filthy mop around the floor, spreading grey water across the linoleum in a manner which can only be described as distinctly half-assed. Alas, after a 14-hour wait, they learned there weren't any beds for Mary to give birth in, as all the patients who should have been discharged months ago were still lying in them festering. One woman had come in for an ingrown toenail in 1996, but because there was no matron, in fact there seemed to be no one in charge, she had remained in her bed for 28 years, living off limp raspberry jelly and dubious-looking moussaka. Instead of sticking around, they upped and headed further into town, but they were turned away from every B&B, inn and overpriced boutique hotel, because every room was taken up by those waiting for asylum claims to be processed, or by working people who'd had to leave substandard landlord's rental accommodation, where for £1,900 a month they were enjoying black mould, backed-up toilets and vermin infestations. The Labour government had promised to do something about this, but it turned out quite a lot of them owned rental properties, and they also were home to the biggest landlord in the British Parliament. It seemed reform was some way off. Wise men arrived bearing gifts. They'd taken a while to get there as the roads were full of potholes, and they'd had to abandon the camel for the last mile, as she was too elderly to be ULEZ compliant and would cost her too much. They were on an economy drive, the wise men, as the government had decreed that their farmland would be subject to inheritance tax. The elderly shepherds were watching their flocks by night, seated on the ground, huddled round a large fire, which was warmer than their huts, where, thanks to the Prime Minister, they couldn't afford to put a gas fire on. Seated on the riverbank, eventually they had to up sticks and head inland, as the stench from the human sewage drifting past made them gag. As they struggled with their flocks across the B Road, the boss of Thames Water zoomed by in a McLaren road car, blaring his horn for them to get out of the sodding way. Presents were eventually delivered by the wise men, who'd left them at the baby's side. Unfortunately that week, overcrowding in the local prison meant that prison wardens had had no choice but to open the cells and release a load of criminals to roam free across this green and pleasant land. Along with those who'd committed domestic violence and sexual assault, a significant delegation of smackheads was also released into the community, much to everyone's joy. The smackheads scooped up the frankincense and myrrh, injected it into their veins, and flogged the gold on Vinted to fund their next hit. A bright star shone in the sky, which was handy, because since the burning of fossil fuels had been banned, people have been forced to endure darkness for 23 hours, as it turned out that solar panels weren't particularly effective in a country where it's always raining. Mary held up, proudly, her newborn baby and declared him to be Jesus Christ. The day would henceforth be known as Christmas Day, until a very short, balding man from Bethlehem Council ordered the event simply to be referred to as a winter festival, for fear of offending anybody. Jesus' father was a toolmaker, and Jesus spent the rest of his life telling that to anyone who'd listen, and those who wouldn't. After a while, everyone headed home, and on the way they were shocked to discover a £22 billion black hole had opened up in the pavement. What had caused it? Fearful it would get bigger, and they'd fall in, they decided to take public transport instead. They stood on the platform edge and waited and waited and waited and waited and waited. And 56 minutes later, a filthy locomotive with graffiti etched on the windows and a blocked toilet pulled into the platform 59 minutes late. A driver dressed head to toe in Armani got out of the driver's cab. A gold Rolex on his left wrist and a gargantuan sovereign ring on his right meant that both arms hung lower than normal, and he walked ape-like to a bench, where he declared to the passengers he was on his lunch. And he then opened a Fortnum & Mason hamper and tucked into wild boar pâté, beluga caviar, and pickled onion monster munch, whilst glugging mouthfuls of Paul Roger champagne direct from the bottle. The station master could sense the atmosphere was turning. People were frustrated, and so he tapped the driver on his shoulder to ask when his lunch hour would be finished. The driver was incensed, but with something which was hard to decipher as anything other than a fat, smug grin, advised the station master that according to Article 9, Paragraph 4, subsection 3c, he had no right to interrupt him on his lunch hour, and that because he had, he was now entitled to restart the lunch hour from the beginning. If the station master didn't believe him, he could check with those in government who'd negotiated this fantastic deal on behalf of the taxpayer. The passengers groaned. Mary went to find the ladies' restroom to seek solace and shelter, and to talk to other ladies, in private, about the burden of being a new mother. She went to breastfeed her infant, but there, in this unisex facility, was a 6'4" man in a leather miniskirt urinating on the toilet seat. The baby would have to wait until it got home to be fed. Tired and emotional, they got on the train. There were no seats, so they sat in first class where the only seats were available. They got home and sat down, excited to be back in their 3-bed semi-haven. The letterbox flapped open, and excited by the thoughts of new baby cards, Joseph headed in the hall. A brown envelope was all that was on the coconut mat, from the railway company, and it was a fine. It was a fine of £165 for having the temerity to sit in the wrong compartment on the train home. Joseph headed back into the living room to break the news to Mary and his newborn, passing the thermostat on the way and turning it down a few degrees. "I'll bring you a cardigan," he said to Mary, "and a blanket for the baby. Welcome, Jesus, to broken Britain." Thank you for listening. I hope you enjoyed. Thank you for joining this channel over the last few months. I feel like I've made 2,500 new friends. I've loved reading your comments, and they are always welcomed. I hope you managed to find some time this Christmas to switch off from the noise and the politics and the politicians, and spend some time with yourselves, with each other, with family, friends, and remember what Christmas is really about. So from me to you, until the roller coaster of crappery starts again next year, Merry Christmas.